So, we talked about Irish terrorism for decades, and kind of now what? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat Risk Consulting in Russell, Canada, and you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, a podcast about all things terrorism and national security related. You know, over the years I've been doing this podcast, we've talked about an awful lot of stuff. We've talked about Islamist extremism, we've talked about the far right, we've even thrown in the old Armenian attack, and of course Sikh terrorism, which was big here in Canada in the 1980s. But when it comes to terrorism as a dominant theme over the better part of 100 years, the Irish had it in spades. I mean, the IRA was so dominant in terms of world terrorism news for decades, for obvious reasons, right? I mean, it was something that was seen in the Anglo-speaking world. It seemed to be a conflict that was going on forever, dating back centuries, in fact. And yet, it all kind of just fell off the radar. And the question then becomes, for those of us who look at terrorism, what would it take to get back on the radar? So I thought I would invite to the conversation somebody who knows a lot more about Irish terrorism than I do. So I'm very pleased to welcome Lorcan Owens to the podcast. I was on his podcast a while ago. He's joining me from Ireland, and we're going to talk about all things Irish terrorism. So Lorcan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Phil. I'm delighted to be here.
So without making this a 4-month podcast, can you kind of walk my listeners through the waning days, if I can call it, of IRA and other Irish-type terrorism in both the North and in the Republic? We all kind of all petered out with it was the Easter Accords in 1998. Where have we kind of been since that time? And are you confident, as an Irish citizen, that we can kind of put the worst of the worst days behind us?
Well, I'll caveat from the get-go that I was 7 when it ended, so I don't have strong memories of the troubles 7. In the North.
Good God, you're a puppy.
It was 1998. Now, I do remember, I mean, it did linger on after that to some extent, but I suppose the high point of it was the Omagh bombings in August 1998 when 29 people were killed by a real IRA bomb, and I remember that, even at 7 years of age. The standout memory for me is the woman absolutely covered in blood walking down the street, and my parents were upset, not crying, but just the shock horror of it, and realizing that this was somewhere in this country that I lived in at 7 years of age, trying to figure out why this is going on. So as to why it ended, I mean, do we go back to the start? So why did it start maybe in the first place? And this year is actually a very important year in the history of Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland was established in 1921 as a result of the War of Independence that took place here in Ireland. And the Unionist majority that lived in the Northeast decided to use their power that was given to them in the Government of Ireland Act by the British government and basically exempted themselves from becoming part of the Irish Free State. And when that state was established...
Of course, yeah, it's been a century now.
I didn't add in my second caveat, by the way, that I'm actually from the South as well. But when that state was established in 1921, when I look back in history, why did it happen? Why were two states created? I think it was inevitable that there was always going to be two states. But I think as to why the trouble started in the first place, it definitely dates back to the establishment of a parliament in Belfast in 1921. I think there would never have been troubles if Northern Ireland had been governed directly from London, from Westminster. If it had been governed from Westminster, there would have been parity of esteem between the two communities. The nationalists, who happened to be Catholic on the majority, or overwhelmingly, and then the Unionists, who were Protestant. And people often think it was a dispute over religion. It really wasn't. It was a dispute about identity, national identity. The Protestants, who are Unionists, identified as British. And why was that? Because they were settlers who moved over in the 1600s, and the Catholics were the descendants, more or less, of Irish, Gaelic, and Normans who had lived there centuries before, thousands of years. So as to why it ended in 1998, to fast forward, I think it was just a marriage of the fact that we had a very pragmatic Prime Minister in the UK at the time, Tony Blair, and here in Ireland we had Bertie Ahern, and their relationship was outstanding. So it was going to come to an end anyway. It was reaching its climax. It had been 29 years, and people were tired, people were weary, and it was the troubles were going nowhere. It was just a tit for tat. You had the IRA on one side that you mentioned in their various guises, the provisional IRA being the predominant one. And then on the unionist side, you had the UDA and UDF. And it was just a tit for tat over and back.
Right.
I know that's simplistic language to use. I mean, real people died in this. 3,500 people died over a 29-year period and tens of thousands injured. But fundamentally, I think why it ended was because there was a recognition that if you want to address terrorism, you're going to have to deal with the terrorists. So in this instance, it was Sinn Féin / the IRA with Gerry Adams. He'll never admit to it, but Gerry Adams was involved in the IRA, and Martin McGuinness. And he, in fairness, Martin McGuinness always admitted he was a member of the IRA. So basically, there was a recognition that if you want to end these troubles, you're going to have to address the people. Because up until that point, I mean, Gerry Adams, his voice wasn't allowed to be heard on television in Ireland and in the UK. I think it ended earlier in the BBC in the UK. But Gerry Adams was this mysterious, opaque figure that we saw on the television, but his voice was dubbed by somebody else. So there was a recognition that you're going to have to bring them to the table. And it was voted for then overwhelmingly. The agreement was settled in an all-Ireland referendum, North and South, overwhelmingly. I think it was 90-something% here and 75% in the North. There was a cohort of unionists led by the DUP who rejected the Good Friday Agreement because it meant that convicted extremists and terrorists would be released. But that happened on both sides. It ended because...
Right.
Just to finish up on this point, or do you want to interject? Sorry.
This is really interesting, and I'd forgotten that it was pretty well 3 decades since the so-called Troubles began in 1969. You made an interesting point, Lorcan, I want to pick up on. You were 7 years old when the Omagh bombings took place, and you can say it was a major terrorist attack at the time. Can you walk us through a little bit more what it was like as a 7-year-old? So, to give you a bit of context, I did a podcast with my eldest daughter who was 12 on 9/11. Now, we were in Ottawa, we weren't in New York or Washington. She has very distinct memories of what it was like. Her teacher's reaction, of course, I was with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service at the time. Dad wasn't home for a long time after 9/11. Can you go through your memories and kind of repaint that picture of what it was like to be a witness to this kind of an attack in your nation, an act of terrorism? I'm really curious about that.
Well, I was only 7, and I think as well, being from the South, and this is something I have to be very mindful of, especially when I speak to people from the North, we weren't part of it. We might be on the one island, and there were bombings in the South. There was bombings in Dublin, I think, in 1973 in Monaghan. But we were basically spectators as to what was going on up in the North. And obviously we felt an emotional connection to what was happening because these are our people on the national side at least, but on both sides, this is our island. We share this island together. But really, we were spectators. And I think even as a child, I was quite aware that it was the North, up the North. It wasn't in my country. As I said earlier, it was, but there was a distinct awareness that the North was a different place, was a place apart. And as much as it was horrific to see what was going on, I think it sounds strange from a child's point of view, but I think I realised how close it was to home when I saw Omagh on the television, and it looked like any Irish town with, the unpainted chimneys and your typical street. It looked like any Irish town. And that for me, I think when I think back actually with hindsight, and then later on, it didn't end. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement ended most of the troubles, but there was still sporadic violence on and off after that. I think the case of the school in Belfast was at Holy Cross School, where loyalist thugs, loyalist gangsters, would you call them terrorists? They probably were involved in terrorism as well, were taunting children going to a Catholic school. That, for me, was quite hard to watch.
Right.
That took place, I think, the early 2000s, latter part of the 90s. And the fact as well, Holy Cross was the name of the primary school. Again, you're bringing it back to your lived experience. It is about religion, supposedly. And you could see the IRA funerals, my flag, all the time, being draped across coffins. And then alongside that, you're seeing, well, why is it that these areas are delineated, the curbing of a loyalist area with red, white and blue? Like these this, I don't want to use the word tribalism, but the way territory was marked out. And you probably know I have a strong interest in Lebanon, and I've been there a few times, and I've done research there. And you can see the correlations. They don't have the flags because they're all Lebanese, but you see the areas are marked out, the Hezbollah areas and the Maronite areas. And you can see these correlations, this kind of encampment mentality. So to answer your question, I think I was very aware as a child that as much as I was aware this was going on somewhere in Ireland, it wasn't Ireland. I know that people mightn't, especially on the nationalists, wouldn't like to hear me saying that, but I was aware it was up the north. That's the way we call it. The carry on up the north, the troubles up the north, the fighting up the north.
Right. I don't want to belabor this point too much more, Lorcan, but one more question. Part of your response really fascinated me is that as a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, you definitely saw up the north as not really part of Ireland. So without wanting to make any kind of, judgmental or non-applicable stereotypical comments, would you say that's generally the case in the times, going back to the Troubles and things, where it really was seen as that what was ever happening in the counties in the Northeast wasn't really Ireland, and that was obviously for historical and political and administrative, all kinds of reasons, that growing up in the South, it was like they were the other, and I'm using the other in that classic academic sense, right? The people who were not the same as you. Was that a general feeling you would say in the environment you grew up in?
That's a hard question to ask, and it's controversial because, in the South, we're supposed to aspire to a united Ireland. We're supposed to want this to happen at some point in the future. I think basically by default, it was just a sense that it was a place apart in terms of circumstance, in terms of what was going on there. You couldn't compare across the border in Donegal or Monaghan or Leitrim. It's sometimes, like, I find it hard to believe that Leitrim borders the north, Fermanagh, because it's just 40 minutes up the road from me. And it's in the south, and it's a peaceful, nice, beautiful place. But I think by default, what was happening there and the scale of sectarianism and the scale of violence at the time, that was just incomparable. It wasn't happening here. Does that mean that they weren't Irish people? Of course not. But their lived experience was so different. And I have to be very mindful about that when I talk about Northern Ireland. I didn't live there. I didn't live through the Troubles.
Of course.
As much as I empathize with it and I try to understand it, I never will be able to. And I think people in the North on both sides can be quite frustrated by we in the South, who on the nationalist side, they would claim that we betrayed them in 1921 and again in 1969 and again all through the Troubles. And then in the British side, they would say the same, that, well, you weren't here in the Troubles, you didn't know what the IRA were doing to us. So it's almost like, is there such a term as outsider's guilt or spectator's guilt? We were spectators. It did straddle the border from time to time. If you're living in Donegal, again, it's about geography. People living in Donegal, which is in the Republic, would have been very aware of what was going on because they were surrounded by the North. And if they wanted to go to Dublin, they had to go through multiple checkpoints and deal with the British Army on a regular basis. My mother worked in the North, in Donegal, not in the North, in Donegal, and she would have encountered the Troubles when the IRA dumped people outside the hospital in Letterkenny after they had kneecapped them. Or refugees, came across into County Louth, and we actually, like, it's hard to believe, to think about it, we had to set up refugee camps in the South in the 70s. Such was the scale of exodus of Northern Catholics escaping from loyalist violence, especially in Louth.
Camps. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these intricacies, and they're not intricacies, this is reality. Like, this is what happened. I think because in the 90s it was starting to come to its end, and it did obviously end in 98, more or less. I think we sometimes forget just how bad it was. Sometimes I watch videos of the Bogside in Derry, or a couple of years ago when the British government apologised for Bloody Sunday, when 14 people actually, one died later, were shot by British soldiers. And you have to pinch yourself and realise this actually happened. Like, this is living memory. This is 40 odd years ago, 30 odd years ago, 20 years ago. and atrocities were carried out on all sides. So to answer your question, I feel like I think we were always aware that they were our people per se, but because their circumstances were so different, you couldn't but call it the North. I mean, they call us the South as well. I mean, partition divided the country in two, and I think even unionists would recognize that that was a painful division. Many unionists in the North actually came from the South. They left during the War of Independence because they were burnt out of their homes. They felt that they so strongly, some of them were burnt out of their homes, others felt so strongly about their commitment to the United Kingdom and to the British identity that they felt that they would have no home here in the south of Ireland. So fast forward to today, we have benefited from how many years? 22, 23 years of peace. And they've brought down all of the borders, border controls. And yet, here we are 100 years later on the anniversary of the creation of Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State, which became the Republic. And we're still dealing with the implications of partition. Only this time, frankly, as an Irish person, it's come from the East. It's come from Britain. They've imposed all of this baggage by Brexit. And I'm not trying to be political about it, but that is just, it's a reality. It's a fact. We're having to deal with the implications of their exit from the European Union. And that's the problem is that when we negotiated the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the Troubles and which brought about a new assembly with parity of esteem between both communities, that was based on the premise that we would have open borders because we were in the same customs. It was taken for granted. We were in the European Union, the customs union. There was no issues with trade. So here we are now. Yeah.
I want to pick up on that, Lorcan. Before I do, you talk about the border, and my only experience is that about a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half ago, my wife and I are in Ireland. My wife is fourth generation Irish Canadian. Her great grandparents came to Canada, probably post potato famine in the 1860s to Canada, and we were there we were on a business trip, and I tagged along, and we crossed the border into the north, and I recall at the time, the only real thing that I noticed was the fact that the currency changed from the euro to the Northern Irish pound, which is based, of course, on the English pound, and that was the only distinction I could make. But so here we are. We're 2021. It's a century after as you say, the establishment of the Republic, and you've brought up Brexit, and you and I have talked already in the last few weeks about how Brexit may be this. I'm not going to call it a turning point, but certainly it's a bone of contention for the reasons that we've talked about. The customs union, the fact that there may be a hard border. There was the big debate, right, with the Johnson government. Will there be a hard border in the north between the Republic and the six counties because of the decision of the British government to leave Brexit? In all honesty, do you think that matters such as this, the hard border, the trade, things like that, do you lie awake at nights thinking this could go south metaphorically really quickly or eventually and lead to possibly a resurrection of the old arguments that were put to bed with the Easter Accords of '98, or am I going down a pathway that really is not very realistic?
Well, I mean, just this week, the national broadcaster here, RTE, had a debate about what a united Ireland would look like. On Sunday, it was all over the papers. Loyalist paramilitaries, and they are still there because we know now that they are still there, they've always been there, are openly threatening the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, and the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister, and they've said basically everybody is a target. So they're blaming us for the Northern Ireland Protocol. And just to explain briefly, the Northern Ireland Protocol was introduced by the British government and the European Union and agreed upon by both parties, which basically leaves Northern Ireland in the customs territory of the European Union while still having full trade with Britain. But because Britain is outside of the customs union and the single market, there has to be checks on goods entering Northern Ireland from Britain. So unionists see that as betrayal because they're being treated differently to Britain. And hence, they've actually turned on their own. I mean, it's bizarre. You couldn't make it up. They've turned on their own unionist politicians, the DUP in particular, because the DUP doggedly pursued this, no, Brexit, we need to leave. The United Kingdom is better off outside Europe. They were warned in 2016, this decision will have major implications, ramifications down the line. Then we realized that the British were going to leave not just the European Union, but every aspect of the European Union, including the customs union and single market. And that's why we realized, shit, like, this is, sorry for my language, we realized this could cause a hard border.
That's okay.
So, I mean, it's about pragmatism. The border between Ireland, north and south, there are 400 crossings. Some of them are boreens, like narrow roads.
Mm-hmm.
They cross through housing estates. They cross through farms. Peshtigo and Donegal is a town either side of the border. So the implications of trying to manage that border on a customs level, it would be like the border between Poland and Kaliningrad, or Turkey and Greece, with all of the paraphernalia involved in that. Except we never asked for this border because we didn't vote for Brexit, and we never wanted any of this. So frankly, why should we deal with the implications of a decision that was made in England? It wasn't made in Scotland. It wasn't made in Northern Ireland either. They voted to remain in the EU.
Right.
So will it lead to a rise in terrorism?
Right.
I mean, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister have 24-hour armed protection now because of viable, real threats being made to their lives by loyalist paramilitaries in the north. I don't think it's going to come from the IRA side at the moment because, frankly, if I was in Sinn Féin, I do want a united Ireland, I'll say that, but I don't want to just have a united Ireland for the sake of it. I think it has to be, we have to have a serious debate about all of the ramifications of it. But if I was a member of Sinn Féin right now, Mary Lou MacDonald, or vehemently adamant that I want a united Ireland, frankly, just sit back and watch the DUP destroy themselves because they realised that they backed the Tories in Brexit and the Tories have burnt them badly. I would just sit back and let this thing carry out because the demographics in Northern Ireland are no longer in the favour of unionism. Northern Ireland there's going to be a census. It's happening right now. They're filling out the census across the UK as we speak. And it'll be very interesting to see the results in that, to see how do people identify. Do they identify as British, Irish, or Northern Irish? How do they identify in terms of religion as well? But it's looking increasingly likely, quite frankly, and I did a podcast with this recently with someone from Northern Ireland, we're going to have a border poll in the next 10 years. Brexit has expedited the need for it. It was an aspiration. It was something that you could just put off in the long finger. Quite frankly, and I'll put my hands up and say it, I was happy with the status quo in Northern Ireland as it was. I was able to go up and down and visit friends if I wanted to. I could work in the north and live in the south and vice versa. There was no need for us. You mentioned the currency. That's the only thing really. The road signs are different. You'll notice the flags when you come into Aucknacoy or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Now, because of all of this, I mean, unionists' existential fear, and it has always been their existential fear, is that they would become subsumed into a predominantly Irish nationalist state. And those fears have been brought to the coalface, but they brought it on themselves. And this is what I'll never understand. Not all unionists, in fairness, most unionists, a lot of unionists, especially the UUP supporters, wanted to remain in the European Union. But the DUP pursued a hard Brexit. They turned down Theresa May's deal, which would have left the UK in the customs union. 3 times they voted it down. Like, they voted that Northern Ireland Protocol, the border in the Irish Sea, as we call it, on themselves. And frankly, it's a bit rich now for them to be coming back, threatening our Prime Minister or whoever else because they didn't get what they want. They were warned. I'm quite annoyed about it. I think most people are.
I know that you shared with me a tweet, I believe it was, whereby there was some kind of actor in the north that put out a photograph about this hard border in the Irish Sea in terms of trade, and the guy looked like a terrorist to me. He had the mask on and the gun and the whole kind of thing. It's funny when you talked about borders, you talked about Poland and Kaliningrad, you talked about Greece and Turkey. As a Canadian, I mean, we've got the longest border with anybody between us and the United States, and I can tell you honestly, prior to 9/11. The border is so long, and as you say, there's all these little country lanes and stuff. And many of the border posts, there's a traffic cone, which you simply have to move to go from one country to the next. And there was never need even to report you were going. Now that, of course, has all changed after 9/11. I remember going to Detroit, which was about a 2-hour drive from my hometown in Southern Ontario in the 70s, and you get to the border post and the guy would say, where you're from, where you're going, have a good day. And that's obviously changed in the past 20 years. But so we've got this, we have these issues that are still outstanding. I think we would probably agree that there's nothing immediate that's pointing to a return to the worst of the troubles in the 60s and 70s and 80s. What do you think, if anything, the Irish experience with terrorism during that time what kind of lessons can we learn from that in terms of the response, in terms of the effect on both societies in the North and in the Republic? Is there anything we should take from that? Because we all know that there will be other terrorist movements. There will be other times of terrorism in the future in a variety of nations. What can the Irish experience teach us? And I'll say us, I'll use that in the Western sense, because I'm not sure that, you talked about Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon is just such a morass and has been for the longest time, and mostly for historical reasons. Thanks to the French, again, for something they did. What are the good things we should take out of the Easter Accords and not the termination, but the extreme decrease in concerns about terrorism in Ireland over the years? Or are there any lessons to learn?
I think there are. I think the Northern Ireland peace accords, as you call them, the Good Friday Agreement, some people call them the Belfast Agreement. It's one of the best documents in terms of a peace settlement, I think, in the world. I'm not saying that in any sort of sense of bias. It just is. It just allowed both communities to decide for themselves. It empowered people themselves to decide how to define themselves. So nationalists were allowed to acquire Irish citizenship and get an Irish passport. Unionists remained British. And if they wanted, they could get 2 passports. The biggest, I suppose the most controversial aspect of it was that they did release convicted terrorists and extremists on both sides. Was that a price worth paying? I mean, we have 23 years benefit of hindsight, and I say yes, it was. I know a lot, I don't know, you mightn't agree with that, and a lot of people in the field of terrorism. But the Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, settled so much of the divisions. And from a democratic point of view, it enshrined the principle of consent. So Northern Ireland could aspire to being part of United Ireland, but only if people consented to it in a referendum. And that's still the case. In the meantime, Northern Ireland status was settled in the UK. They established a new police force because the previous police force was completely tainted. The RUC was 80-90% Unionist Protestant, had a notorious record of discrimination. They were disbanded and replaced with a police force that represented both communities. So there was public buy-in to the new institutions. They re-established the Stormont local parliament in Northern Ireland with parity of esteem. So we've the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister. They're basically the same role. So you basically have 2 prime ministers running concurrently. And it's a compulsory coalition between both sides. So I think definitely in terms of policing, there was complete disarmament. The IRA gave up, the provisional IRA gave up all their weapons. I remember watching that on television. It was there in a room, and there was, I think it was Father Alec Reid. He was a renowned peacemaker, and there was a moderator from the Presbyterian Church. They were the witnesses. And all of the other different groups disbanded. A couple didn't. There was breakaway groups from the IRA. But by and large, it all ended. Why did it end? Because the reasons I just outlined. There was a recognition that Northern Ireland, when it was created in 1921, was favoured overwhelmingly towards the Unionists. And that's why I go back to my original point. Why did terrorism occur? When Northern Ireland was established, they established a parliament within Northern Ireland that favoured overwhelmingly Unionists. And they almost straight within a couple of years, they abolished they abolished proportional representation. They gerrymandered constituencies, which always produced a Unionist majority, even in nationalist areas like Derry. There was discrimination in housing. There was only homeowners could vote in local elections, and homeowners were nearly always Protestant. So all of this discrimination was allowed to bubble for 40, 50 years. How could they have prevented the Troubles breaking out in 1969? Really and truly, with hindsight, the British government should have ruled Northern Ireland directly and not allowed a situation whereby the RUC were discriminating against Catholics, or local government was gerrymandered to always produce a Protestant majority. So the lessons to be learned are many, I would say. If you see blatant discrimination occurring in a society, or one group of people are being suppressed, and this is government policy, the chances are you're going to get a backlash at some point. And we see that happening all over the world. We see it with the Rohingya. We see it happening with the Uyghurs right now, which is a genocide. It's happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
People who are being suppressed. I mean, why does terrorism occur? There are all kinds of reasons, and I know you specialize in Islamist terrorism. But when it comes to these issues of national identity, and a minority of people within another state are being continuously suppressed, I mean, people will.
Yeah.
I'm not in any way justifying what happened, but you're going to get a backlash at some point. And in fairness, it was actually Edward Carson said it. He was a unionist who fought for the creation of Northern Ireland, but he was from the south. He was from Dublin. And he said when Northern Ireland was created, we need to be, paraphrasing now, but he basically said, we need to be careful with the creation of Northern Ireland that Catholics don't feel ostracized, that nationalists don't feel that they're not going to be able to hold a stake in the society, because this will become an inherently unstable country. And this was 1921, and he was proven correct. But now we're dealing with the implications of a potential rise in terrorism again. So what do we need to do today? The rhetoric needs to be pared back massively on both sides. I think at the moment the talk of United Ireland is frankly it's not the right time, because can we just deal with the implications of the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment, and try and reduce any tensions that there are about it. I mean, the DUP are definitely milking it. They're saying, trade with Britain has been massively curtailed. There's been issues with garden seeds. There's been issues with dogs need pet licenses. I'm not being smart. They're not massive issues. They're just latching on to this perception that Northern Ireland is not fully within the UK. It is. The currency is the pound sterling. The Queen is the head of state. The Union flag was flying over Belfast City Hall on St. Patrick's Day. It is in the UK. It's being treated differently in terms of customs arrangements. That's actually an advantage to Northern Ireland, because they have unfettered access to the European Union market and to Britain. And frankly, I think there are definitely sections of unionism that are realised now, look, it's not 1921. We have a 50-50 balance here now in the country. There is a growing cohort, and I think this is the best thing for Northern Ireland. There's a growing cohort of people, especially my age, who are not neutral, but they are voting for Alliance. Alliance Party is basically secular, non-aligned, neither for UK or joining the United Ireland. They're basically pure Democrats. They want the will of the people, and they just want Northern Ireland to function as it currently is functioning. And their support for them is surging. And a growing number of people are no longer defining themselves as either Catholic or Protestant, because, I mean, it was never really about religion. And most people in the north around my age, they're not practicing either religion. So I think there's a lot of hope for the future, actually. I think once the issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is sections of unionism that are going to have to kind of get a grip and realise that, as I say, things have changed. They don't have... I often think that they feel they can dictate even to the British government. They're saying, we're not going to... The Northern Ireland Protocol should be scrapped. The British government have signed this treaty with the European Union. You can't dictate international treaties. I'm sorry. You're one party. You're one of many. But yeah.
Well, it certainly sounds like I'm detecting a cautious optimism here. And you make an interesting point, I think, about the new generation, such as yourselves. You're a lot younger than I am, where if there even were, if there were a religious aspect to this in the past, and I happen to agree with you, I think it was certainly spun as a Catholic Protestant thing, but it never really was about that. The sense of religiosity today amongst your generation certainly is nowhere near what it was in my generation. Even in my generation, it was already starting to, I think, wane in terms of, I mean, I grew up, it's funny you mentioned about Catholic and Protestant. So I grew up as a Catholic in Southern Ontario, and we were right beside what we call a public school. So basically everything that was not Catholic. It dates back to, it's Ontario history. You don't have to worry about the details. But, growing up, we still referred to the people next door in public school. So PS, the P didn't stand for public. It stood for pagan. They were the pagan schools. We were the Catholic schools, and this is in 1960s, London, Ontario, Canada kind of thing. Lorcan, I think we could probably talk for days about this particular aspect, but I do want to give you a chance to share with my listeners the fact that you also have a very good podcast on which I was very honored to be a guest. Can you give my listeners a little bit of a sense as to what your podcast is all about and where they can find it?
I can, indeed. My podcast is called Nazra, which is an Arabic word for kind of perspective or an insight, N-A-Z-R-A. So Nazra, Politics, Society and Extremism. Initially, I was focusing very much on the Middle East, but I'm starting to broaden into more general topics and issues. Just this week, I interviewed an analyst discussing the UK's foreign policy document that they launched this week. So yeah, it's quite broad. I'm hoping to broaden it further, but I suppose the orientation generally is the Middle East. And as you said, I was delighted to have you on. We discussed Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism. So generally talking about the Middle East, but starting to broaden into other issues related to politics and world affairs.
Well, excellent. I'm going to put the link on this when this podcast comes out, so hopefully you'll gain some more fans from that. But Lorcan, listen, thank you very much for sharing your views. You know what? As an old intelligence analyst, there's something really, really simple, and that's you go to the original source as often as you can when you gather information on which to base your opinion. So you're about as close as an original source as I could come up with on the Irish question. So thanks for taking the time today to talk to me.
No, I really appreciate it. And as I say, I am from the South, so I'm just add that caveat in because people from the North will always say, no, he's from the South, he doesn't really get it. But I try to display a balance on it. And as you say, I hope that I think there's a lot of guff in the threats of terrorism, and I hope it stays that way, that it's just talk.
Well, I might take you up on your challenge and find someone from the North for my next podcast. But thanks again, Lorcan. So that was my conversation with Lorcan Owens on the situation in Ireland. Of course, it's something that has evolved over many, many years. I was glad he reminded me that 2021 is the centenary of the establishment of the Republic, and he's cautiously optimistic. So let's hope he's right. That was Canadian Intelligence Day. I'd like to see what you thought about the podcast. You can certainly reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the podcast, you want to get more, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get free access to all the podcasts, all the blogs. There's also a link there to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. Terrorism is seen through the eyes of counterterrorism practitioners. It's not an academic book, it's a practitioner book. And as well, you can join us live stream. I live stream on Mondays and Thursdays. It's called Who Terrorized Who Today. It's on YouTube. You can find me. Love to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, take care.